The foreign countries made a conspiracy in their islands. All at once the lands were removed and scattered in the fray. No land could stand before their arms. From Hatti, Kode, Karkemish, Azawa, Alashia, and on, being cut off one at a time. A camp was set up in Amaru. They desolated its people, and its land was like that which has never come into being. They were coming forward, toward Egypt, while the flame was prepared before them. Their confederation was Apeliset, Tejakar, Shekelesh, Danua, and Weshwesh, lands united. This apocalyptic confederation of marauders has become collectively known as the Sea People. The late Bronze Age world they participated in setting ablaze was inhabited by a conglomeration of wealthy and powerful empires. Babylon, Mitanni, Egypt, Hatti, and the Mycenaean Greeks had ruled the region for many centuries, in tandem with many smaller kingdoms and states. A complex, interdependent cultural, economic, and political order developed between these great states. Dynastic marriages, lavish gifts, and skillful diplomacy between the imperial houses allowed for longer and more frequent periods of peace over a larger geographical area than had previously existed at any point in the Near East. These empires clashed in massive battles and wars. However, the goal was not to annihilate one's foes, but to increase the taxable population and control lucrative trade routes. It was not uncommon for the people of a newly conquered territory to receive a tax break. In the build-up to the collapse of the Bronze Age, the Mitanni Empire fell victim to internal infighting that allowed the Assyrians to obtain independence, and along with the Hittites, cannibalized the alien empire, setting up puppet states that they eventually absorbed. While Libyan tribes began to opportunistically raid Egypt with some success, a new people, a piratical band of seafarers, the Sheridan, or Shardana, began to raid Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean. The Sheridan are perhaps the first significant piratical group to terrorize a large geographical region in history. The earliest raids began in the late 14th and early 13th centuries BC, and were small with around 5 ships and a couple hundred men. Soon, raids composed of over 20 ships and 1,000 men. Although these numbers may seem relatively small, these exploited a Bronze Age world completely unprepared for defending against amphibious assaults. Ramses II of Egypt said of them, "The unruly Sheridan, whom no one had ever known how to combat. They came boldly sailing in their warships from the midst of the sea, none being able to withstand them." Ramses claims to have been the first to defeat them. It is significant to note that during his reign, captured Sheridan were settled in the Nile Delta, as well as Canaan. Sheridan mercenaries were incorporated into the ranks of the Egyptian army, and even his personal bodyguard was composed of Sheridan warriors. Reminiscent of the later Roman Empire employing Germanic barbarians within its ranks to defend the frontier, the Egyptians increasingly did the same. Libyan tribes as well as Nubian mercenaries were settled within Egypt, and they may have had a policy of, if you can't beat them, hire them. The Shardana have long been closely associated with the island of Sardinia, first because of the obvious linguistic similarity, and then through the material culture of the island. That has clearly demonstrated numerous times the Nuragic culture's predilection for horned helmets, as well as round-studded shields, which the ancient Egyptians depicted them wearing. It is still debated whether the Sheridan originated from western Anatolia and settled among the Sardinians after the Bronze Age collapse, or as it is increasingly viewed, they were the indigenous Nuragic inhabitants of Sardinia, taking advantage of the turbulent times. Both of these positions have compelling arguments to support their cases, with a Sardinian connection being near certain. The Shardana were the first significant marauding people of the sea the Egyptians encountered. The first of 2 invasions of Egypt by large coalitions of sea peoples occurred in the reign of Ramses II's son, Merneptah. They invaded the Nile Delta in alliance with Libyan tribes who had been longtime enemies of the Egyptians, and several new groups of people. The Shekelesh, Luka, Ekwesh, and Teresh. One of these groups of sea peoples, we know exactly who they were, the Luka of southwestern Anatolia. The Luka were a collection of small states that were sporadically vassals of the Hittite Empire, who campaigned against them frequently, seeking to dominate this rebellious seafaring people. Considered pirates, they had carried out yearly raids on the kingdom of Alashia in earlier times. The Shekelesh are a more mysterious group. Some scholars have placed them in southern Sicily, Italy, or near the Luka in Anatolia, based on the similarity of their name to transliterations of ancient geographic and people names of those regions. Colorful armor, a pointy beard, and a medallion worn around the neck were some of the characteristics typical of them, as well as an Aegean-style kilt, that may indicate close cultural contacts with them, or, in fact, that was their place of origin. The Ekwesh or Ekwash have been generally accepted by scholars to be the Mycenaean Greeks, the Achaeans, or Ahiawa as they were known to the Hittites. As Mycenaean Greece was in the early stages of a rapid collapse, more and more Mycenaean Greek pottery dating to this period has been found on Cyprus, which the Luca regularly raided. Here it is likely the two formed an alliance. It is also reasonable to assume that the Sheridan pirates had been using the Aegean Islands for decades in their raids against Egypt and the Eastern Mediterranean, as it is the logical location to do so. Here, the first great coalition of the Sea People must have organized their plan to take on Egypt, including the Teresh, or Tersha, who have been loosely associated with the city of Troy, based off of the similarity to the name Tarusia, which the Hittites used for the city in one record. This small group may have been refugees from the city that was most likely destroyed by the Mycenaeans. It is interesting to note that in Homer's Odyssey, Odysseus tells a fictitious story of himself, where years of successful maritime raiding culminated in an ill-fated attempt on the Nile Delta, where he then lived for 7 years afterwards, becoming wealthy working for the Egyptians. Odysseus' tale may be a confused folk memory of the Sea People's assault on the Nile Delta, which also ended in failure. And as with the Sheridan, many of these defeated warlike seafarers may have found lucrative careers in Egyptian service. Many brought their families and livestock along with them in the attack on the Delta, and in the end, many did likely find a new home there. 30 years later, the ancient and mighty Hittite Empire was no more, as was most of the states of Anatolia and Alatia, the great palace citadels of Mycenaean Greece that had not already been destroyed were either burnt or abandoned. Assyria and Kassite Babylon contracted, and were most likely dealing with a crashing economy, internal feuding, and displaced populations. Egypt alone was still undertaking large building projects and maintained a relatively unscathed empire, when a second wave of new sea peoples arrived, with a couple familiar faces. The most mysterious of this second group of sea people are the Washesh, with really nothing more to go off besides the name, and again have been connected to the Trojans or Walusans, as well as a variety of other wild speculation. The Dan-Una, or Denyen, and the Peliset, as well as the Tejeker, are all depicted by the ancient Egyptians as wearing arms and armor extremely typical of the Mycenaean Greeks. It is generally accepted that the Dan-Una are the Mycenaean Greek Danoi. Their exact point of origin in the Mycenaean world is still debated, and several less accepted theories identify them with the biblical tribe of Dan. The Mycenaean identity of the Peliset and Tejeker is even more certain. After Ramses III defeated this second Sea Peoples coalition, both of these peoples were settled in the Levant, and large amounts of Mycenaean-style pottery has been found at their sites. Ramses III asserted to have settled vanquished people, among them the Peliset, in strongholds bound in his name. This has led some to believe the settlement of the Philistines in Canaan took place under Egyptian supervision. Later in the reign of Ramses III, a motley assortment of sea people are depicted following a line of native Egyptian soldiers in a battle, wearing the feathered or horsehair headdresses along with the Aegean-style kilts. It was perhaps Egypt's ability to assimilate different groups of people into their army, and properly motivate them to fight for them, often against their brethren, that allowed them to survive the Bronze Age apocalypse, which saw the collapse of Kassite Babylon 20 years after the defeat of the Sea Peoples in 1177. Egypt would lose its empire in the Levant, and its survival would be in a much diminished form, as a shadow of its former self, while the Philistines would become a significant independent power in the region for many centuries, and are immortalized in the biblical account as a frequent nemesis of the Hebrew tribes. The Dark Age that engulfed the Near East is perhaps the darkest in history. Massive depopulation, combined with literate societies becoming illiterate, had severe repercussions. There were many causes to this Dark Age, besides the Sea People, but they definitely played their part. These were peoples familiar to the ancient Egyptians, the majority most likely centered in western Anatolia, the Aegean Islands, Sardinia, and Sicily. As Ramses III said, they made a conspiracy in their islands. This video is part of Operation Odysseus, a collaboration between 17 fantastic YouTube channels, all making nautical-themed videos. Please check out the link in the description for the entire playlist. Videos also focused on the ancient world have been created by History March, Stefan Milo, and Archaea Historia. And as always, huge thanks to my patrons.